It began with a splinter, not a metaphorical one, but a real, needle-sharp and deeply insulting sliver of aged pine that lodged itself in the fleshy part of my palm. I was on my knees on the weathered dock of our lakeside house in upstate New York, a place of profound natural beauty that had, over the years, become just another item on a long list of duties. I was wrestling with a rotten plank my husband, Robert, had been meaning to fix for 3 summers. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and the heady perfume of budding lilacs from a bush I'd pleaded with him not to cut down, was a sweet, heavy blanket. It was late spring, that brief, glorious window after the final thaw, and before the city people arrived with their roaring jet skis and their hollow, performative laughter. I swore under my breath, a word I rarely used, and dropped the hammer with a clatter that felt satisfyingly disruptive. It was in that moment of quiet, impotent fury, staring at the tiny dark wound in my hand, that I realized it was a perfect metaphor for my life. A small, sharp, and deeply buried point of irritation inside something that, from a distance, looked perfectly serene and enviable. The splinter didn't just hurt, it offended me. It was a physical manifestation of the neglect I had grown accustomed to. My husband's voice, a familiar, authoritative baritone, echoed faintly through the open screen door of the house. He was on a conference call, as he always was, his voice a relentless engine of commerce that seemed entirely alien in this tranquil setting. Robert, a man who saw the world as a series of problems to be solved and projects to be managed, had recently been promoted to head of regional development. This lake house was his latest project. He'd bought it for the view and the value, but he rarely saw the former and was only interested in increasing the latter. He hadn't noticed the wisteria was choking the rain gutters with a slow, beautiful violence, or that the dock was surrendering to the water, one rotten plank at a time. He didn't see the details, he only saw the bottom line. Just that morning, he'd stood on the porch, his phone pressed to his ear, and surveyed the property. "The deck needs power washing," was all he'd said, not to me, but into his phone, a note for some future billable hour. His new director, a man named Elias Vance, was apparently driving up from the city to drop off some urgent schematics. Robert had mentioned it over a distracted breakfast. "He's an odd duck," Robert had mused, scrolling through emails on his tablet. "Old school, quiet, doesn't say much, but the man doesn't miss a thing, makes people nervous." I was still trying to coax the infuriating splinter out with a dirty fingernail when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A moment later, a man appeared at the edge of the lawn that sloped down to the water. He was tall, perhaps in his late 50s, with a thick head of silver hair that caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the birch trees. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple, well-worn linen shirt and dark trousers. He carried a large leather portfolio under one arm. He didn't call out or wave. He just stood there for a long moment, his hands in his pockets, observing the scene, the house, the water, the overgrown garden, his presence a sudden point of stillness in the landscape. It was only after he had taken it all in that his gaze finally landed on me. "Eleanor?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried calm and even across the lawn. I stood up, feeling clumsy and disheveled. I brushed the dirt and sawdust from the knees of my old jeans and instinctively hid my injured hand behind my back. "You must be Elias," I said. "Robert's inside." "He's on a call." It was my standard greeting, the well-worn preface to my existence in this house. "So I hear," he said with a faint, wry smile that touched his eyes but didn't seem condescending. He started walking down the slope, his steps sure-footed on the uneven ground. His eyes weren't on my face but on the hand I was hiding. "Trouble?" "It's nothing," I said, a little too quickly. "Just a splinter." I felt inexplicably foolish, as if I'd been caught failing some simple rustic test of self-sufficiency. He stopped in front of me, closer than I expected. The air between us immediately felt different, charged. He smelled faintly of sandalwood and old books. "Let me see." It wasn't a request, but a gentle command, offered with a quiet authority that left no room for protest. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then slowly brought my hand from behind my back, uncurling my fingers to reveal the angry red mark and the dark sliver embedded within. He set his portfolio down on a weathered wooden bench and held out his own hand. I placed my palm in his. His fingers were long and cool, his touch surprisingly delicate as he cradled my hand to examine the wound. The world seemed to contract, shrinking to that single startling point of contact. The scent of the lilacs intensified. The gentle lapping of the water against the dock pilings grew louder, each sound distinct. I was acutely aware of my own ragged breathing. "Hold still," he murmured. He produced a small silver pair of tweezers from a worn leather pouch on his belt I hadn't noticed. I found myself staring at the intense concentration in his face, the way his brows furrowed slightly. He worked with a surgeon's calm precision, his head bent, his breath warm against my skin. In that moment, he was entirely focused on this small, insignificant task, on this small, insignificant pain of mine. The intimacy of it was staggering. It had been years since anyone had touched me with such focused, gentle attention, free of agenda or expectation. When he finally drew the splinter out, it was with a faint, satisfying pluck. "There," he said, looking up at me. His eyes were the color of moss after a rain, a deep, thoughtful green, and they held mine for a second longer than was necessary. In that gaze, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something I had forgotten was possible. I felt seen. Not as Robert's wife, not as the caretaker of the lake house, but as Eleanor, a woman with a splinter in her hand, standing on a dock in the late spring sun. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice hoarse. He released my hand slowly. His eyes drifted past me to the untamed garden, the peeling paint on the boathouse, the shimmering expanse of the lake. "You look more at home out here than in the house," he said. It was a simple observation, yet it landed with the force of a profound revelation. He was right. The house was Robert's domain of order and ambition. The wild, neglected outdoors was mine. The spell was broken by Robert's voice bellowing my name from the porch, a sound that felt like a physical intrusion. "Eleanor, is that Elias?" Elias stepped back, the invisible current between us dissolving instantly. He picked up his portfolio. "I should deliver this," he said, his tone once again polite, professional, and distant. I watched him walk up the slope to the house, a tall, quiet man who had, in the space of 5 minutes, noticed more about me than my husband had in 5 years. I stood on the dock for a long time, the palm of my hand tingling where he had touched it, and I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that something more than a splinter had just been pulled free. That night at dinner, an oppressive quiet hung between Robert and me. He was energized, talking at length about the schematics Elias had brought, about market projections and zoning variances. "Elias is a smart guy," he said, gesturing with his fork, "a real hands-on problem solver, gets right to the heart of the matter." I nodded, the irony a bitter taste in my mouth. The part of me that had been awakened on the dock was still humming, a low, secret vibration beneath my ribs. I felt like a tuning fork that had been struck, and the world was now resonating at a different frequency. Later, unable to sleep, I was drawn to the glassed-in sunroom at the back of the house. When we bought the place, it was meant to be my art studio. I used to paint. The shifting light on the lake, the stark beauty of the winter trees, the explosion of summer green, it had been my muse, my language. Now, The room was a dusty mausoleum for forgotten ambitions, filled with stacked patio furniture and boxes of old financial records Robert had deemed storage. In the corner, draped in a yellowed, ghost-like sheet, stood an old easel. I pulled the sheet away, releasing a cloud of dust that danced in the moonlight. The scent of old turpentine, faint but sharp, pricked my memory. My fingers, trembling slightly, traced the outline of a half-finished canvas. It was a landscape of the lake at dawn, all misty purples and soft emerging golds. I remembered the morning I started it. I had been young, filled with a quiet confidence. And then, what? The slow, creeping demands of Robert's career, the needs of our children, the insidious belief that my art was a frivolous indulgence compared to his very real, very profitable work. I had let it go without a fight. I had let myself go. Standing there, in the silent, dusty room, I felt a grief so profound it was like a physical weight in my chest. A few days later, Robert, who was working from the city for the week, called. He needed a document from the house signed and dropped off at the small satellite office he'd set up in the nearby town. "Elias is working from there this week," he'd said. "It's faster if you just hand it to him." My heart gave a stupid, youthful lurch. I told myself it was ridiculous. I was a grown woman. But I took more time getting ready than I had in years. I showered and washed my hair. I put on a pair of jeans that fit well and a soft cornflower blue sweater that brought out the color of my eyes. I even put on a touch of mascara and a faint trace of the perfume I only wore on special occasions. I didn't realize the extent of my own careful preparation until I was halfway there, and the recognition sent a hot flush of shame and exhilaration through me. The office was a small, unassuming space above a quiet bookstore. Elias was on the phone when I arrived, but he saw me through the glass pane of his door and, with a warm smile, gestured for me to come in. His office wasn't what I expected. Instead of corporate charts and sterile furniture, the walls were lined with old framed maps, nautical charts of the Great Lakes, topographical maps of the Adirondacks. It felt less like an office and more like a scholar's study, a place for contemplation. "I hoped it would be you," he said after he hung up the phone. "It's just a folder," I said with a nervous laugh, handing it across the heavy oak desk. "Still," he said, setting it aside as if it were the least important thing in the room. He gestured to a worn leather armchair that didn't quite match the rest of the furniture. "Please, sit for a minute." I sat. The silence that fell between us wasn't awkward. It was full, expectant. "You've been on my mind, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice soft. I looked up, startled by his directness. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He gave a gentle, contemplative shrug, leaning back in his chair. "Because you surprised me. I spend my days with people who broadcast every thought, every ambition. They fill every silence. You hold the silence. There's a stillness to you, but it's not empty. It's the stillness of a painter, someone who watches the world, really watches it, waiting for the light to change." My breath caught in my throat. It was the second time he had seen a part of me I had thought was extinct, buried under layers of wifely duty and quiet resignation. "You read people too well," I murmured, feeling my cheeks grow warm. "Only when I care to," he replied, his gaze steady and kind. He leaned forward, his hand resting on the desk between us, palm up, an offering, an invitation. After a long, charged moment that felt like an eternity, I reached out and placed my hand in his. It wasn't a reckless gesture. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a moment of quiet, profound acknowledgement of a shared truth. His thumb gently stroked the back of my hand. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "But I don't believe in ignoring something that feels this real." I nodded, unable to speak. I knew exactly what he meant. The woman who used to paint, who used to feel the world with a raw, vibrant intensity, was stirring from a long, deep sleep. "I don't know what this is," I said carefully, finding my voice at last. "Neither do I," he answered, "but it's something." I drove home in a daze, the world outside my car windows rendered in hyper-vivid color, as if a layer of dust had been wiped from my eyes. That night, I didn't go to the master bedroom. I dragged a mattress into the dusty studio and slept there, surrounded by the ghosts of my forgotten canvases, the scent of turpentine a comforting balm. It wasn't an act of rebellion against Robert, it was an act of reunion with myself. The days that followed were suspended in a strange, beautiful light. Elias didn't call or text. He respected the lines that existed in my life, and that respect, I realized, was more seductive than any overture. He left the space for me to decide what came next. One afternoon, a week later, he called. "I'm heading out of town for a conference," he said. "I'll be gone for a few days. I was hoping, would you be willing to take a walk with me before I go?" It was late afternoon. The sky was awash of lavender and rose. I told Robert, who had just returned from the city, that I needed some air, that the house felt stuffy. He barely looked up from his laptop. "Okay, honey." "Don't be long." Elias met me at the trailhead by the park, a quiet, winding path that curved along the water's edge. We walked slowly, the silence between us as comfortable as our conversation. We talked about everything and nothing, about the scent of pine after a rain, about old books we loved, about the way some memories can sneak up on you and steal your breath. He told me about his wife, who had passed away years ago, and about his daughter, a marine biologist in Oregon. He spoke of them with a love that was both deep and peaceful. He was a man who knew how to hold on to things without being trapped by them. He stopped when we reached a small, arched footbridge that crossed a trickling stream. The trees leaned in, their branches forming a natural cathedral around us. "I'm not asking for anything, Eleanor," he said, turning to face me. The fading light caught the silver in his hair. "I need you to know that I have no right. But I don't want to pretend that meeting you hasn't been significant." "I know," I said, my heart aching with a sweet, unfamiliar sadness. "For me, too." He looked at me then, not with hunger or possession, but with something that felt like reverence, as though I were a fragile, precious moment he didn't want to rush. And then, without urgency, without pressure, he leaned in. His lips brushed mine, a touch as soft and cool as moss, as gentle as the evening breeze. It wasn't a kiss of fire and passion. It was a kiss of recognition, of tenderness, of a deep and unspoken understanding. It tasted of longing, wrapped in respect. It was an acknowledgement of the something we both felt. When he stepped back, the world felt irrevocably altered. Something inside me had exhaled after holding its breath for 20 years. We walked back in a shared, peaceful silence, the unspoken truth of that single gentle kiss hanging in the air between us. When I got home, Robert was asleep in his armchair, the blue light of the television flickering across his slack face. I looked at the man I had spent my life with, and I felt a profound sorrow for the vast, silent ocean that had grown between us. I leaned down and turned off the TV, then gently brushed a lock of hair from his forehead. He didn't stir. In the days Elias was gone, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went to the art supply store in town. I bought new canvases, a full set of oil paints, and fresh turpentine. I cleaned out the sunroom, moving Robert's boxes to the garage. I set up my easel by the large glass window overlooking the lake, in the very spot where the morning light was best, and I began to paint. He came by one last time, the day before he was set to move on to another region. It was early evening. Robert was out, conveniently. I saw his car pull into the drive and met him on the porch. I'm glad to see that, he said, his gaze going past me to the easel visible through the sunroom window. You reminded me, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. You reminded me that I was still in here, that the woman who sees light and color hadn't died. She was just dormant. She was never dormant, Eleanor, he said softly, his moss-green eyes full of a deep kindness. She was just waiting for you to look. I took a deep, steadying breath. I need to try, I said, glancing back at the silent house that was slowly beginning to feel like mine again. With Robert, I need to see what's still possible. I owe our story that much before I decide to start a new one. He nodded, a look of complete, quiet understanding on his face. I know. He reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder, a brief, warm pressure, a final, respectful acknowledgement. I'm very glad I met you, Eleanor Vance. Me too, Elias, I replied. Then he turned and walked to his car. I stood on the porch and watched until his taillights disappeared down the long, winding road, feeling not a sense of loss, but a sense of profound and quiet gratitude. There is no tidy ending to a story like this, no neat bow. Life is layered, and love evolves and devolves in mysterious ways. Later that week, Robert came home early. He found me in the studio, deeply absorbed in my work. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched me, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He walked over to a finished canvas leaning against the wall, a vibrant, impressionistic landscape of the lake at sunset. I forgot you could do that, he said, his voice filled with a quiet, uncertain awe. It's beautiful, Eleanor. He looked from the painting to me, and for the first time in a very long time, he seemed to be truly seeing me. What made you start again? I looked at my husband, at the man who had become a stranger in my own home, and I felt the first tentative stirring of hope. I remembered I could, I said simply. He reached out and took my hand, my uninjured hand, and his touch was hesitant, unfamiliar. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't absolution, but it was a question, and it was a start. Elias hadn't walked into my life to offer an escape. He had walked in to hand me a compass, to remind me that I was worthy of being seen. He had helped me find a splinter of my old self, and now it was up to me to see if it could be made whole again.